Miss Marple and the Deadly Halloween Game. Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and it's truly wonderful to have you with us again. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what's the weather like there? I always enjoy reading your comments. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1, Lanterns. Snapdragon and a Prize. The parish hall of St. Mary Mead had been transformed for Halloween. Though Miss Marple, observing the preparations from her vantage point near the tea table, privately thought that turnip lanterns possessed a somewhat gruesome quality that modern pumpkins lacked entirely. The hollowed vegetables, each carved with a leering face, cast wavering shadows across the whitewashed walls, and the smell of singed turnip flesh mingled with the more pleasant aromas of cider and spiced biscuits. It was the evening of October 31st, 1958, and the village had turned out in respectable numbers for what the Reverend Clement had ambitiously titled a parlor games night in the old tradition. Miss Marple had attended such affairs before, though she could not recall one quite so elaborately staged. There were to be fortune-telling with apple peels, a performance by the village mums, and, as the grand finale, the game of Snapdragon. Such a dangerous amusement, Miss Marple murmured to her friend, Lady Bantry, who had settled beside her with a cup of decidedly tepid tea. I remember as a child watching my brother snatch raisins from the flames. One boy burned his fingers quite badly. Oh, but that's half the fun, Jane, Dolly Bantry replied, her eyes bright with anticipation. Besides, they've put Arthur Keene in charge of the arrangements. He's far too sensible to let anyone come to harm. Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the hall to where Arthur Keene, the village watchmaker and jeweler, was indeed supervising the placement of a large, shallow basin upon the central table. He was a solid man of perhaps 55, with the careful movements of one accustomed to working with delicate mechanisms. His sister Martine stood nearby with a notebook, ticking off items with methodical precision. Arthur's a good man, Miss Marple agreed, though I fancy he's not been entirely pleased with the new competition on the high street. Dolly followed her gaze to where Vivian Sloane held court near a small display of curios and jewelry that he had apparently been permitted to set up as a stall. Sloane was a newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having opened his antiques and jewelry shop only 6 months prior. He was perhaps 40, sleek and handsome in the way of men who attend carefully to their appearance, and he moved through the gathering with an easy confidence that bordered on swagger. Vivian does rather put people's backs up, Dolly admitted. All that continental polish, and the way he flirts with that pretty schoolmistress, Miss Larrick. His wife's still in the village, you know, estranged, but still here. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I had heard something of that nature. Mona Sloane stood apart from her husband, engaged in what appeared to be an accounting task at a small side table. She was a cool-looking woman of perhaps 38, her dark hair drawn back severely, her expression one of remote competence. She wore a good tweed suit that spoke of better days, and she handled the papers before her with the efficiency of one trained to manage accounts. She's staying at the vicarage guest cottage, Dolly continued, warming to her theme. Griselda Clement says Mona's been absolutely civil about the whole affair. Helps with the parish books. Very obliging. But one does wonder what she's thinking. Miss Marple wondered too, though she kept this to herself. In her long experience of human nature, the coolest exteriors often concealed the most turbulent emotions. The Reverend Clement clapped his hands for attention, and the murmur of conversation gradually subsided. Friends, neighbors, welcome to our Halloween celebration, he began, his pleasant voice carrying well in the flagstone hall. We have an evening of traditional diversions ahead. But first, let me explain the rules for our grand finale, the game of Snapdragon. He gestured to the basin on the table, which Arthur Keene was now beginning to fill with raisins from a large paper bag. In the basin we have placed 4 special prizes among the raisins, the vicar continued. A silver thimble, a sixpence, a small lucky charm, and a silver ring. The ring, I'm told, carries with it a particular forfeit. The finder must kiss it for luck, and then, he paused dramatically, must bestow a kiss upon someone else in the room, chosen by popular acclaim. There was a ripple of laughter and several knowing glances directed at Vivian Sloane and the pretty schoolmistress. Daphne Lyric, who stood near the mum's changing area, her cheeks distinctly pink. Though actually, came Mona Sloane's clear, carrying voice, I believe the tradition tonight shall be that my husband awards the kiss himself. It seems only fair, as he donated the ring. The laughter grew louder, and Vivian Sloane swept an elaborate bow, his teeth very white in his tanned face. My dear Mona, ever the organizer, he said lightly. Naturally, I shall be delighted to participate in this ancient custom. There was something in the exchange that made Miss Marple's needles pause in their steady clicking. The words were pleasant enough, but she had lived too long and observed too much not to catch the undertone. Mona Sloane's smile had not reached her eyes, and Vivian's gallantry had carried a faint edge of mockery. Dr. Haydock, who had materialized at her elbow in his usual silent fashion, bent down and murmured, "Nasty little domestic drama, that. Sloane's been systematically stripping his wife out of the business. Heard it from the solicitors in Much Benham. She put up half the capital when they started, but he's got her on paper now as merely an employee, paid by the month." "Dear me," Miss Marple said softly. "How very unpleasant. Chap's a bounder," Haydock continued, "and clever with it, though. Always just inside the law. Arthur Keene refused to witness some bill of sale last month. Said it wasn't his place to help a man rob his own wife." Before Miss Marple could respond, the lights in the hall were lowered, and a general movement toward the central table began. The turnip lanterns seemed to grin more wickedly in the dimness, and someone had opened a window, allowing a drift of autumn air to set the flames guttering. Arthur Keene produced a large bottle of brandy and began to pour it carefully over the raisins in the basin. The sharp, warming scent filled the immediate area. Martine handed him a box of long matches. But before he could strike one, Mr. Pratt, the chemist and ironmonger, bustled forward. "Here now, Arthur. You'll want a bit more spirit than that for a proper flame," he said, producing a jug from beneath his coat. "Just a splash of the meths I brought for the storm lamps. Makes a lovely bright flame, it does." Arthur Keene frowned, but Mona Sloane had already taken the jug with a smile. "How thoughtful, Mr. Pratt," she said. "A snapdragon ought to have a really spectacular flame, don't you think? For the children's sake." She tipped a measure of the methylated spirits into the basin before Arthur could object, then stepped back, the jug in her hand. "There now," she said. "Let the games begin." Miss Marple, watching from her chair, thought that Mona Sloane's hands were remarkably steady. Too steady. Perhaps for a woman whose husband stood not 10 feet away, preparing to kiss the young woman who had, by all accounts, replaced her in his affections. The Reverend Clement struck a match and touched it to the brandy. With a soft whoosh, blue flame sprang up across the surface of the basin, dancing over the raisins like will-o'-the-wisps. In the darkened hall, the effect was both beautiful and slightly uncanny. The game of Snapdragon had begun. Chapter 2. Blue Flame. Silver Kiss. The blue flames danced across the basin with an otherworldly glow, casting strange shadows on the faces gathered around the table. Miss Marple found herself reminded of medieval woodcuts depicting spirits and demons, though she immediately chided herself for such fanciful thoughts. It was merely brandy flame, nothing more sinister than a parlor trick that had entertained generations. Yet there was something about the quality of the light that struck her as unusual. The flames burned with a particular brightness, almost violet at their edges, and they seemed to leap higher than she remembered from Snapdragon games of her youth. Mr. Pratt's methylated spirits, she supposed. The chemist stood near the window looking rather pleased with himself. "Now then," called Arthur Keene, holding up a pair of elegant silver tongs. "Who's brave enough to be first? Remember, you must be quick. Snatch your raisin from the flames and pop it straight in your mouth before it burns you." There was a moment of hesitation. Then young Tom Reed, the organist's nephew, darted forward and plucked a raisin with his bare fingers, yelping and laughing as he tossed it from hand to hand before finally eating it. "Well done, lad," Dr. Haydock called out. "Though I'd recommend the tongs for the next brave soul." One by one, villagers approached the basin, some using the tongs, others risking their fingers in the time-honored fashion. Each successful snatch was greeted with applause and laughter. The room had grown warm with a press of bodies and the heat from the flames, and someone had closed the window again, making the air close and thick with the scent of burning spirits. Miss Marple observed that Mona had positioned herself near the table, ready to assist with the tongs when required. She handled them with a practiced ease, passing them to each participant and retrieving them afterward. Her face remained composed throughout, though once, when Vivian Sloane made some jest that earned appreciative laughter from Miss Larrick, Miss Marple saw the briefest tightening around Mona's mouth. Daphne Larrick had been hanging back, half hidden behind the mum's costume rack. But the crowd began to chant her name. "Miss Larrick. Miss Larrick, your turn." The young schoolmistress stepped forward with becoming reluctance, though Miss Marple noted the glance she cast toward Vivian Sloane. She was a pretty thing, Miss Marple thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with soft brown hair and large eyes. She had the look of a girl who had read too many romantic novels and not enough of the practical sort. "I'm terribly nervous," Daphne confessed, accepting the tongs from Mona Sloane. "What if I knock the whole basin over?" "You won't, my dear," Mona said, and her voice was kind enough, though her eyes remained distant. "Just be decisive. Choose your target and go for it cleanly." Daphne leaned over the basin, the blue flames reflecting in her eyes. The crowd had gone quieter now, watching with interest. Miss Marple saw Daphne's hand move toward one section of the basin, then hesitate. There had been a small folded paper under her plate earlier at the tea table. Miss Marple remembered. She had seen the girl read it and blush. Then with sudden determination, Daphne's hand darted down. The tongs closed around something bright, and she lifted it triumphantly from the flames. "The ring!" someone shouted. "She's got the ring!" Indeed, between the jaws of the tongs, a silver band gleamed with unusual brilliance. It caught the firelight and seemed to wink with an almost aggressive shine, quite different from the mellow glow of honestly polished silver. "Kiss it. Kiss it!" the crowd began to chant, and Daphne, her cheeks now flaming as brightly as the brandy, raised the ring to her lips. She touched it delicately, barely more than a brush of contact, then quickly extended the tongs toward Vivian Sloane. "Your turn, Mr. Sloane," she said breathlessly. As arranged, Vivian Sloane stepped forward with a theatrical flourish, playing to the crowd as naturally as an actor takes the stage. He was clearly enjoying the attention, the focus of every eye in the room. "Ah, the ancient custom," he announced grandly. "A kiss for fortune, a kiss for luck, though I fancy I'm the fortunate one tonight." Surrounded by such charming company, he took the tongs from Daphne's hand, his fingers briefly covering hers in a gesture that was probably meant to appear accidental, but struck Miss Marple as entirely calculated. Then he raised the ring before his face, studying it with exaggerated care. "A handsome piece," he declared, "though I say so myself, having provided it. Now then, let's do this properly." With a grin that showed all his white teeth, Vivian Sloane pressed the ring firmly to his lips. He held it there for a moment, then pulled it away with a flourish, the ring still gripped in the tongs. "There," he said. "Sealed with a kiss." And now he stopped mid-sentence. His hand holding the tongs wavered slightly. The grin faded from his face, replaced by an expression of puzzlement. "Odd," he said. His voice had changed, become somehow thicker. "Taste of almond." Miss Marple sat forward in her chair, her knitting falling unheeded to her lap. She had heard that particular note before, in a voice beginning to fail. Vivian? Mona Sloane's voice cut through the sudden hush. "Are you quite well?" But Vivian Sloane was not well. His face had gone from ruddy to a curious gray-white, and beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. The tongs fell from his hand with a clatter, the ring bouncing once on the wooden floor before rolling to rest against the table leg. "Can't breathe." Vivian gasped. His hand went to his throat, clawing at his collar. "Something wrong." Dr. Haydock was already moving, pushing through the crowd with the purposeful haste of a medical man who recognizes an emergency. He reached Vivian just as the man's knees buckled. "Someone fetch my bag from the cloakroom, quickly now." But even as willing hands rushed to obey, Miss Marple could see that it was already too late. Dr. Haydock lowered Vivian Sloane to the floor, his fingers at the man's neck, searching for a pulse. The blue flames in the Snapdragon Basin still danced and guttered, casting their eerie light over the scene. Vivian Sloane's breathing had become a terrible rasping sound, harsh and labored. His pupils, Miss Marple noticed with a distant, clinical part of her mind, had contracted to mere pinpoints. His body jerked once, twice in an awful spasm. Then he was still. Dr. Haydock remained bent over him for perhaps another minute, trying first one thing and then another. But when he finally sat back on his heels, his face told the whole story. "He's gone," the doctor said quietly. "Dead before he hit the floor. Near enough." A scream rose from somewhere in the crowd. Miss Larrick, most likely, though Miss Marple did not turn to look. Her attention was fixed on Inspector Slack, who had been attending the party in an unofficial capacity but now pushed forward with all the authority of his office. "Nobody leaves," Slack announced, his voice hard. "Nobody touches anything. This room is now a crime scene." "Crime?" Arthur Keene sounded bewildered. But surely it was the shock, or perhaps the vapors from the spirits. An accident. "Tragic, but we'll determine what it was," Slack interrupted. "Dr. Haydock, what's your initial assessment?" The doctor stood, brushing off his knees. His face was grim. "Could be several things," he said carefully. "But that almond smell? The rapid onset, the pupils. I'm not prepared to rule out poisoning until we've made a proper examination." "Poisoning?" The word fell into the shocked silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread outward through the gathered villagers. Poisoning? Here in St. Mary Mead, at a church social? It seemed impossible, absurd. Miss Marple's eyes moved from the body on the floor to the silver ring that lay where it had fallen. Even in death's presence, it gleamed with that too bright shine, quite unlike the warm patina of well-kept silver. She thought of the tongs in Mona Sloane's capable hands, thought of the methylated spirits that had made the flames burn so very bright and blue, and she thought of Daphne Larrick's hesitation before she reached into the basin, as though she knew exactly where to look. The game of Snapdragon was over, but another, far deadlier game had only just begun. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a frosted shine. Inspector Slack had taken command of the situation with the efficiency of a man who, whatever his other failings, understood the importance of preserving evidence. The body had been covered with a tablecloth hastily fetched from the vicar's vestry, and the crowd had been herded to the far end of the hall, where they stood in hushed, uncertain groups, occasionally casting fearful glances toward the shrouded form on the floor. Miss Marple had not moved from her chair. At her age, she reflected, one was permitted certain privileges. And besides, from her current position, she had an excellent view of the Snapdragon Basin and the area immediately surrounding it. The blue flames had finally guttered out, leaving the raisins scattered in a pool of cooling brandy. "Jane, you should come away," Dolly Bantry urged, her voice shaking slightly. "It's too dreadful. That poor man." "In a moment, dear," Miss Marple replied absently. Her eyes were fixed on the silver ring that still lay where it had fallen near the table leg. Even in the restored gaslight of the hall, it possessed that peculiar brilliance she had noted earlier. Dr. Haydock was conferring with Inspector Slack in low tones. Miss Marple's hearing was not what it once had been, but she caught fragments. "Rapid action suggests a powerful agent. Prussic acid, possibly. Need a proper post-mortem." "Right," Slack said decisively. "And I want statements from everyone who was near that table. Everyone who touched those confounded tongs or that ring or had anything to do with setting up this Snapdragon business." He turned and raised his voice to address the assembled company. "Now then, I'll need to speak to each of you in turn." The vicar's offered his vestry as an interview room. Dr. Haydock will remain here to ensure nothing is disturbed. And I do mean nothing. Is that clear? There was a general murmur of assent. Mona Sloane stood very straight and still, her face composed but pale. Daphne Lyric had dissolved into tears and was being comforted by Griselda Clement. Arthur Keene looked thoroughly shocked, while his sister Martine had produced a handkerchief and was methodically polishing her spectacles, a gesture that Miss Marple recognized as a sign of severe distress. As Slack began organizing his interviews, Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair. Her knees protested a little, but she ignored them. There were things that needed to be observed before too many official hands disturbed the scene. "Dr. Haydock," she said softly, approaching the doctor. "I wonder if I might examine that ring for just a moment." "I promise not to touch it." Haydock looked at her sharply, then nodded. He had known Miss Marple long enough to trust her instincts, even when they led in unexpected directions. "Just looking, mind," he cautioned. "Slack would have my head if evidence was tampered with." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. She bent down, her old bones creaking, and studied the ring where it lay. Up close, the peculiarity of its appearance became even more pronounced. The silver was indeed bright, but it was not the brightness of careful polishing. Rather, it had an almost harsh quality, and in the elaborate scrollwork that decorated the band, she could see tiny particles that caught the light. "A magnifying glass," she murmured. "Have you one in your medical bag, doctor?" Haydock produced a small lens, which he held while Miss Marple peered through it at the ring. What she saw confirmed her suspicion. The scrolls and chasings of the design were not merely bright, but frosted with what appeared to be minute crystals. They clung deep in the crevices of the metalwork, a fine white grain that was quite distinct from the silver itself. "Not polish," she said thoughtfully. "Something has dried there, something that crystallizes." "Poison, you're thinking?" Haydock kept his voice low. "Perhaps. Or the residue of something used to clean the silver, though if it were merely a cleaning agent, one would surely rinse it thoroughly afterward." She straightened up, her gaze moving to the tongs that Mona Sloane had used throughout the evening. They had been set down on the edge of the table, and Miss Marple moved to examine them as well. "Curious," she observed. "What's curious?" Haydock followed her, his professional interest clearly aroused. "These tongs, they were held near the flames repeatedly this evening, were they not? Each time someone snatched a raisin, the tongs were heated." "Yes, I suppose so. And yet Mrs. Sloane handled them without difficulty. I watched her pass them from person to person, retrieve them, use them herself. She showed no sign of discomfort from the heat." Miss Marple reached out carefully, not quite touching the tongs. but holding her hand near the metal. "They're barely warm now," she said. "But that flame only died out 10 minutes ago. Metal tongs of this sort should retain heat for considerably longer." She bent closer, adjusting her spectacles. On one jaw of the tongs, barely visible, was a smear of something clear and slightly greasy. It was not soot, which would have been black and dry. This was something else entirely. "Doctor, what would prevent metal from heating as it should?" Haydock frowned and thought. "A barrier of some sort, I suppose. Something between the metal and the heat source. But these tongs were in the flames. I saw them myself." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But what if they had been treated with something beforehand, something that would insulate them, prevent them from becoming too hot to handle comfortably?" Before Haydock could respond, her attention was caught by the tablecloth beneath the basin. The white linen showed clear signs of spillage where brandy had slopped over during the evening's excitement, but around the basin there was a distinct pattern to the staining. The cloth bore a pale blue rim, darker in some places than others, and the edges of this stain were scorched more deeply than seemed warranted by simple brandy flames. Miss Marple reached out and very gently touched the edge of the scorched area. The fabric was still faintly damp, and when she lifted her fingers to her nose, she caught a scent that was not quite brandy, sharper, more chemical. The methylated spirits that Mr. Pratt had contributed? Of course, but something else as well. "That scorch mark," she said to Haydock. "Does the color strike you as odd?" The doctor studied it. "Now you mention it, yes. There's a violet tinge to it, not what you'd expect from burning brandy alone." "No," Miss Marple said. "Not from brandy alone." She moved around the table, her eyes searching. Lady Bantry had been right to suggest she should sit down again. Her legs were beginning to ache abominably, but there was one more thing she needed to find. There, on the small side table where Vivian Sloane had displayed his curios earlier in the evening, she spotted a bottle. It was small glass with a label that proclaimed Argentum Polish, for the finest silver. The bottle was nearly full, but the cap was slightly loose, and when Miss Marple carefully lifted it, not touching the glass itself, but using a corner of her handkerchief, she could smell that same metallic sweet scent that had caught her attention on the scorched tablecloth. "Dr. Haydock," she called softly. "I think Inspector Slack should see this." But even as the doctor went to fetch the inspector, Miss Marple's keen nose detected something else. Beneath the sharp chemical smell of the polish, beneath even the lingering scent of brandy and methylated spirits, there was the faintest trace of something bitter. Something that reminded her unpleasantly of the marzipan her nephew Raymond had once brought her from abroad, except that this smell was not sweet, but rather medicinal and faintly threatening. Bitter almonds. Dr. Haydock had mentioned prussic acid, which was another name for cyanide, and cyanide was notorious for its characteristic smell of bitter almonds. She thought again of the frosted grain in the ring scrollwork, of the too bright shine that spoke of recent and aggressive cleaning, of the tongs that had somehow remained cool enough to handle despite repeated exposure to flame. Someone had been very clever. Someone had understood that a game, a tradition, a moment of festivity could be turned into a weapon, and that someone had planned carefully, attending to details that most people would never think to consider. Miss Marple returned slowly to her chair and picked up her knitting. Her fingers moved automatically through the familiar motions, while her mind worked along quite different patterns. Inspector Slack would conduct his interviews and collect his statements. He would send the ring and the body for analysis. He would follow procedure, and eventually he would arrive at the truth. But Miss Marple had already begun to see the shape of it, forming like a picture emerging from morning mist. Not the whole picture yet, but enough to know that this death had been as calculated as a mathematical proof, and that somewhere in this hall stood someone who had chosen murder, with the same cool precision with which one might choose a move in chess. The question was not whether it was murder. That much was clear. The question was, who among them had possessed both the knowledge and the cold determination to poison a silver ring and plant it in a snapdragon basin, knowing exactly who would pluck it from the flames and who would seal their own death with a celebratory kiss. Chapter 4. The brandy that was helped. The vestry had become an impromptu interview room, though it seemed to Miss Marple a singularly inappropriate setting for the discussion of murder. The small space was cluttered with choir robes and hymn books, and a rather dingy print of the Good Shepherd hung askew on the far wall. Inspector Slack had commandeered the Reverend Clement's writing desk and sat behind it with the air of a man determined to get to the bottom of things through sheer force of will. Miss Marple had not been summoned for interview yet, being presumably considered a mere witness of the aftermath rather than a participant in the events leading to the crime. This suited her purposes admirably, as it allowed her to observe the comings and goings with interest. Mr. Pratt, the chemist and ironmonger, emerged from the vestry, looking distinctly uncomfortable. His usual ruddy complexion had taken on an unhealthy grayish tinge, and he mopped his forehead with a large handkerchief despite the October chill that had crept into the hall. "Dreadful business," he muttered to no one in particular. "Never thought I'd see the day when a church social turned into—" He trailed off, catching sight of Miss Marple, and hurried past with a mumbled greeting. Lady Bantry, who had refused to leave her friend's side, leaned close and whispered, "He looks positively stricken. Do you suppose he had something to do with it?" "I suspect Mr. Pratt's distress has more to do with the methylated spirits he provided," Miss Marple replied quietly. A helpful gesture that has now taken on rather sinister implications. Indeed, when Inspector Slack emerged from the vestry a few moments later to confer with Dr. Haydock, his expression suggested that he had learned something significant from the chemist's testimony. "The man admits he brought meths to boost the flames," Slack said, his voice carrying more than he perhaps intended. "Says Mrs. Sloane asked him to, for a better show. Claimed he didn't think twice about it." "Methylated spirits burn hotter and brighter than brandy alone," Haydock observed, "and with a different color to the flame." "That's as may be," Slack replied. "But why would anyone want the flames burning hotter? Unless they wish to mask something," Miss Marple interjected gently from her chair. Both men turned to look at her. "Forgive me for interrupting, but I couldn't help overhearing." "A brighter, more vigorous flame might serve to disguise another scent, might it not?" Slack frowned, but Haydock nodded slowly. "The bitter almond smell," he said. "Cyanide has a distinctive odor, but in the midst of burning spirits with all that chemical smell—" "Exactly," Miss Marple agreed. "And there is another consideration. The methylated spirits would account for that violet tinge to the scorch marks on the tablecloth. Quite distinctive, that color. Not at all what one sees with ordinary brandy flames." Slack pulled out his notebook and made a notation, though his expression suggested he was not entirely pleased at having his investigation assisted by an elderly spinster. "That's all very well, Miss Marple," he said stiffly, "but the question remains, who added the spirits to the basin?" "Mr. Pratt brought them," Haydock pointed out. "At Mrs. Sloane's request, so he says. Though he also claims he merely lent her the jug. And she did the pouring herself." At that moment, Arthur Keene appeared from the direction of the tea table, where he had been sitting with his sister. His face was set in grim lines, and he approached the inspector with evident reluctance. "There's something I ought to mention," he said without preamble, "about that methylated spirits business. It struck me as peculiar at the time, but I said nothing. Wish I had now?" "Go on," Slack encouraged. Keene glanced around as if uncomfortable speaking before an audience, but continued nonetheless. "When Mrs. Sloane added the spirits to the basin, she poured rather liberally, more than a splash. I'd say, enough to make the brandy considerably more flammable than it needed to be. "You saw this clearly?" Slack asked. I was standing right there, managing the matches. I nearly objected. As a matter of fact, it seemed ungentlemanly somehow. Adulterating good brandy with methylated spirits, like mixing a fine wine with water. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Did Mrs. Sloane give any reason for adding so much? Keen turned to her, his weathered face troubled. She said Vivian liked a showy flame. Said he'd mentioned wanting the snapdragon to be properly dramatic, something the village would remember. There was a moment of silence as the implications of this settled over the group. If Vivian Sloane himself had requested the enhanced flames, then the matter became more complex, unless, of course, Mona Sloane had been lying about her husband's preferences. It would be remembered right enough, Haydock said grimly. Arthur Keene shifted his weight uncomfortably. There's more. When she poured the spirits in, I noticed her hands, steady as stone they were. Now, I don't know much about women's nerves and such, but I'd have thought any wife, even an estranged one, would be a bit shaky about her husband making a public fool of himself with that young schoolmistress. But Mrs. Sloane was calm as a summer morning. Miss Marple considered this. In her experience, excessive calm could be as revealing as excessive emotion. A woman who had steeled herself to commit murder would need to maintain iron control over her nerves. You didn't care for Mr. Sloane. I think, she observed to Arthur Keene. The jeweler's face darkened. I'll not speak ill of the dead, Miss Marple. But no, I didn't care for him. Sharp practices in business and cruel in his personal dealings. Asked me to witness some document last month that would have stripped his wife of her rightful share in their shop. I refused, told him it wasn't proper. He laughed at me, called me old-fashioned. Yet, despite your dislike, you agreed to oversee the Snapdragon arrangements, Miss Marple noted. The vicar asked me to supervise the safety aspects, Keene replied. It was a church function, after all. I couldn't refuse. Besides, I never imagined... He gestured helplessly toward the covered form on the floor. Inspector Slack had been making notes throughout this exchange. Now he looked up sharply. This document you mentioned, what was its nature? A bill of sale transferring the stock and goodwill of the shop entirely to Vivian Sloane made his wife out to be nothing more than a paid employee, though she put up half the initial capital and had worked as his partner for 6 years. Legal, perhaps, but morally repugnant. And you refused to witness it? I did. Told him to find some London solicitor if he wanted that sort of thing validated. I'd have no part of robbing a woman who'd stood by him when he was starting out with nothing. Slack made another note. I'll need the name of his solicitor. This could establish motive, financial gain, you're thinking? Haydock interjected. Would the wife inherit if the document wasn't properly executed? That would depend on the current state of their legal arrangements, Slack replied. But it's certainly worth investigating. Miss Marple set down her knitting and addressed Arthur Keene once more. The brandy used tonight. From where did it come? Parish stores, Keene replied. We keep a supply for church functions. The bottle was brought up from the cellar this afternoon. And who had access to it between then and the time the flames were lit? Keene rubbed his forehead wearily. Any number of people, I suppose. It sat on the side table while we prepared the hall. Anyone could have tampered with it, though I can't imagine why they would. But Miss Marple could imagine. The brandy itself need not have been poisoned. That much was clear. The poison had been on the ring, but the brandy had been augmented with methylated spirits to create a fiercer, brighter flame that would mask the telltale scent of almonds and create a spectacle to distract attention from the careful choreography of death. Someone had thought this through. With meticulous care, someone who understood chemistry and timing, who could remain composed while pouring volatile spirits into a basin, knowing that within minutes those flames would become the backdrop for murder, and someone who had access to the materials needed, the methylated spirits, the silver polish or cleaning solution, and most critically, the cyanide itself. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the small figure of Mr. Pratt, still sitting alone near the door, his head in his hands. A chemist would have access to all manner of dangerous substances, but so would Arthur Keene, with his workshop full of chemicals for cleaning and treating precious metals. And so perhaps would Mona Sloan, if she had planned ahead and known where to obtain what she needed. The brandy that had been helped was only one piece of a larger puzzle, but it was an important piece. It spoke of premeditation and of someone who understood that in order to commit murder in a crowded room, one needed not just poison, but also distraction, theater, and a careful manipulation of everyone's attention. The question now was, who among them possessed not only the means and opportunity, but also the cold resolve to turn a festive game into an instrument of death? Chapter 5. The Tongs That Stayed Cool. The interviews dragged on past 10 o'clock, and the parish hall had grown decidedly chilly. Someone had opened the windows to clear the lingering smell of spirits and smoke, and autumn air now flowed freely through the space, making the remaining turnip lanterns gutter and dance. Miss Marple had finally been permitted to give her statement to Inspector Slack, though it had consisted mainly of what she had not seen rather than what she had. She had been seated away from the immediate action, had not observed anyone tampering with the basin or the prizes, had merely witnessed the tragic culmination of the evening. Slack had dismissed her with barely concealed relief, clearly preferring witnesses who had something definitive to report. She had returned to her observation post near the tea table, where Martine now sat with a cup of cold tea growing even colder before her. The woman's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and her face bore the particular stillness of someone keeping firm control over strong emotion. "A terrible shock for you," Miss Marple ventured gently. Martine looked up, her eyes magnified slightly behind her spectacles. "For all of us," she replied. "Though I confess I find myself thinking more about how it was done than about poor Mr. Sloane himself." "Does that make me heartless?" "Not at all. The human mind seeks to understand what it cannot immediately accept. It's quite natural. I keep thinking about those tongs," Martine continued, her voice low. "I noticed something odd about them, though I said nothing at the time." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Indeed?" "They're sugar tongs, actually, from the vicarage tea service. Mrs. Clement lent them because they're long-handled and decorative. But here's the thing, Miss Marple. Sugar tongs of that particular design are notoriously poor at conducting heat. The handles are hollow, you see, and the metal is quite thin. They heat quickly but also cool quickly. How interesting. You have knowledge of metalwork, then. I keep Arthur's books, but one can hardly manage the accounts of a jeweler's shop without learning something of the trade. Those tongs should have been uncomfortably hot after being held near flames for the better part of an hour. Yet Mrs. Sloane handled them repeatedly without the slightest sign of discomfort." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "You observed her closely." "I was managing the tea urn, which gave me a clear view of the table." Mrs. Sloane passed those tongs from person to person, retrieved them, used them herself. Her hands never flinched, never showed any sign that the metal was hot, even when she handed them to Miss Larrick for the final time. "Just before—" Martine's voice caught slightly. "Just before it happened." "And you found this unusual?" "Very. I tried an experiment once with similar tongs, helping Arthur with some demonstration at the shop. Held them near a candle flame for merely a minute, and they became too hot to touch comfortably. These tongs were near flames far longer, and far hotter thanks to that wretched methylated spirits." Miss Marple considered this carefully. Her own observation had noted the same peculiarity, but having it confirmed by someone with technical knowledge was valuable indeed. "What might account for it?" she asked. Martine adjusted her spectacles, a gesture Miss Marple was beginning to recognize as indicative of deep thought. A coating of some sort, perhaps something insulating between the metal and the heat. When I mentioned it to Arthur just now, he suggested perhaps a thin layer of oil or grease. That would be visible, surely. Not necessarily. A very thin application, carefully done, might be nearly invisible to casual observation, but it would be there if one looked closely. A slight sheen, perhaps, or a residue. This aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's own discovery of the greasy smear on the tongs. She made a mental note to ensure Inspector Slack was made aware of this detail, assuming Dr. Haydock hadn't already mentioned it. Mrs. Sloane handled the tongs most frequently this evening, Miss Marple observed. Yes. She seemed to have appointed herself the guardian of them. Kept them close at hand, passed them out, and collected them back. Very organized, very methodical. Though I suppose that's her nature. Arthur says she's absolutely meticulous with accounts, never a penny out of place. The kind of person, Miss Marple reflected, who would plan carefully and attend to every detail. The kind of person who would think to grease the tongs so they could be handled repeatedly without arousing suspicion about why they remained cool. Lady Bantry approached, carrying 2 fresh cups of tea. Here, you both look frozen. Miss Marple, you really should let me take you home. This ghastly business has gone on long enough. In a moment, Dolly dear. Miss Marple accepted the tea gratefully. Miss Keene was just explaining something rather technical about the tongs. Those tongs, Dolly said with a shudder. I shall never look at sugar tongs the same way again. To think that something so ordinary, so domestic, could be part of such a horrible deed. Every murder weapon was once an ordinary object, Martine observed with unexpected philosophy. A kitchen knife, a silk stocking, a bottle of medicine. It's the intent that transforms them. Well, I think intent is a dreadful thing to contemplate, Dolly declared. To plan such a death in such a public setting, it argues a mind quite devoid of normal feeling. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. In her experience, murder was rarely committed by those devoid of feeling. Quite the contrary. It was usually strong feeling, twisted and distorted by circumstance, that drove people to such extremes. Hatred, certainly. Fear sometimes. Greed often, but also love. Or what had once been love before it curdled into something darker. Inspector Slack emerged from the vestry once more, this time with Mona. Sloane, the widow, if she could be called that, bore the same composure she had shown throughout the evening. Her face was pale but calm, her posture erect. She wore no widow's weeds, of course. But then she had been estranged from her husband, and could hardly be expected to don mourning for a man she'd been in the process of legally separating from. You're free to return to your cottage, Mrs. Sloane, Slack was saying, though I must ask you to remain available for further questions. Of course, Inspector. I have nowhere else to be. Her voice was steady, almost detached. Shall I be permitted to make arrangements for my husband's funeral? Or must I wait for the official investigation to conclude? Best wait for the post-mortem results, Slack replied gruffly. Could be several days. Mona nodded once sharply and moved toward the door. She paused near Miss Marple's chair, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in that glance that Miss Marple could not quite interpret. Not guilt, certainly. Perhaps resignation, or possibly a strange species of satisfaction. Quickly masked. Good night, Miss Marple. Good night, Mrs. Sloane. After she'd gone, Martine leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, Did you see her hands? No burns, no marks. Nothing to suggest she'd spent the evening handling metal near flames? Yes, Miss Marple replied. I did notice that, and indeed she had. Mona Sloane's hands had been as smooth and unmarked as if she had spent the evening doing needlework, rather than orchestrating a game of Snapdragon. No redness from heat. No soot under the fingernails. Nothing to indicate she had been anywhere near those flames, except perhaps for one small detail that Miss Marple had glimpsed as Mona passed beneath the gaslight near the door. There, under the nail of her right index finger, was the faintest trace of white. Not soot, which would have been black. Not silver polish, which would have been gray, but something that had left a chemical whitening, the kind of mark left by caustic substances on human skin. The kind of mark that might be left by a woman who had recently handled something far more dangerous than silver polish or methylated spirits, the kind of mark that spoke of cyanide. Chapter 6. 2 rings, 1 box. Morning brought a gray drizzle to St. Mary Mead, the kind of persistent rain that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind turning over the events of the previous evening like pages in a book she could not quite finish reading. By 9 o'clock she was dressed and at her breakfast, though she had little appetite for Mrs. Reed's excellent porridge. The summons from Inspector Slack came at 10 o'clock. Would Miss Marple be so kind as to join him at the parish hall? There had been a development. She arrived to find the hall transformed from the festive scene of last evening into something resembling a photographer's studio. The snapdragon basin remained on the table, now surrounded by various implements of investigation. Dr. Haydock was present, as was Arthur Keene, who stood near a small card table where various objects had been laid out with careful precision. Miss Marple? Slack greeted her with more courtesy than he usually managed. Good of you to come. We've been examining the physical evidence. Mr. Keene here has pointed out something rather significant. Arthur Keene looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight. His usually ruddy face was haggard, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the card table. I brought Vivian Sloane's ring box from the prize drawer, he explained. The vicar had asked me to prepare the prizes for the Snapdragon game yesterday afternoon. 4 items as specified: a thimble, a sixpence, a lucky charm, and a silver ring. On the table lay a small velvet-lined box, the kind jewelers used for storing valuable pieces. It was divided into compartments, and Miss Marple could see that it had been designed to hold multiple items. The thing is, Arthur continued, his voice rough with fatigue, this box had spaces for 2 rings, not 1. See here? He pointed to 2 circular depressions in the velvet, side by side. When I prepared the prizes yesterday, both spaces were filled. 2 identical silver rings, or nearly identical. I assumed Sloane kept duplicates for display purposes. Many dealers do. And now? Slack prompted. Now there's only 1 ring in the box. The other was the one placed in the basin last evening. Arthur picked up the remaining ring with careful fingers. Look at this one closely. It's tarnished, honestly aged, the patina you'd expect from a Victorian piece that's been handled over the years. He set it down and gestured toward a sealed evidence bag that contained the fatal ring. That one, the one from the basin, is bright. Too bright, almost garish in its shine, as though it had been aggressively cleaned. Miss Marple moved closer, peering at both rings through her spectacles. The difference was indeed striking. The ring in the box had the warm, slightly dulled glow of silver that had aged naturally. The ring in the evidence bag possessed that peculiar frosted brilliance she had noted the previous evening. 2 rings, she murmured. But why would one be cleaned so thoroughly while the other was left to tarnish? That's what we're trying to determine, Slack said. Mr. Keene, when did you last see both rings together? Arthur rubbed his forehead wearily. Yesterday afternoon around 4 o'clock. I collected the box from Vivian Sloane's curio stall to prepare the prizes. Both rings were present then. I placed one in the basin along with the other prizes and returned the box to the prize drawer for safekeeping. And the drawer was accessible to others? It's backstage behind the mummer's changing area. Not locked. No. Anyone involved in the preparations could have accessed it. Dr. Haydock spoke up. The question is whether someone switched the rings, took the tarnished one from the basin and replaced it with the cleaned, poisoned one. Or, Miss Marple suggested gently, removed the poisoned one from the box and placed it in the basin, leaving the honest ring in the box as evidence that nothing untoward had occurred. Slack made a note. Either way, it suggests premeditation. Someone knew there were 2 rings and planned accordingly. Where's the second space in the box now? Miss Marple asked. Empty, you said? Arthur nodded. Completely empty? No trace of a second ring. Then the murderer either placed the poison ring in the basin directly or swapped it for the original after Mr. Keene had prepared the prizes. Both scenarios require knowledge of the box's contents and access to both the box and the basin. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. According to yesterday's statements, several people had access to that area between 4 and 8 o'clock when the game began. Mrs. Sloane was arranging prizes and guarding her husband's curio stall, which was adjacent to the storage area. Miss Larrick was setting up the various games. Mr. Pratt delivered his methylated spirits. The mummers were in and out of their changing area. Even the vicar and his wife were backstage at various points. A considerable number of suspects, Miss Marple observed. Too many, Slack grumbled, though some can be eliminated by simple logic. The vicar and his wife had no motive whatsoever. The mummers were village youngsters who barely knew Sloane. That narrows it somewhat. Arthur Keene cleared his throat. There's something else. Agnes Reed, who helps Mrs. Clement with parish duties, mentioned to me this morning that she saw Mona Sloane collecting a parcel from the post office yesterday around 4. A parcel? Slack's interest sharpened immediately. Agnes said it was small, wrapped in brown paper and straw, like something fragile. She noticed because Mona seemed rather pleased about it, smiled when she took it. Agnes thought perhaps it was a gift. Miss Marple's fingers moved absently over her knitting, which she had brought along. Mr. Keene, you mentioned earlier that Mr. Sloane kept his cleaning supplies at his shop. What sort of substances would he have used for silver? The usual commercial polishes mostly, though he did mention once having acquired an old-style silver dip from somewhere. Said it worked better than modern preparations for heavily tarnished pieces, though it was dangerous stuff. Had to be handled carefully. Old style, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Would that be the cyanide-based variety? Arthur's face went pale. Good Lord. Yes, I suppose it would be. They banned that formula years ago, or mostly banned it. Too toxic for general sale, but specialist dealers sometimes kept it for restoration work. And would Mr. Sloane have kept such a substance at his shop? I couldn't say for certain. He never showed it to me, but he was the type to acquire unusual items, especially if he thought they gave him an advantage in the trade. Slack stood abruptly. Right then, we need to search that shop thoroughly. If there's cyanide silver dip on the premises, I want it found. There's another possibility, Miss Marple ventured. Mr. Pratt's chemist shop, would he stock such substances? He might, Arthur admitted reluctantly. For professional use only, mind you. He supplies me with various chemicals for cleaning and repairs. Keeps them behind the counter. Requires a signature for anything dangerous. Then Mr. Pratt's sales ledger should prove illuminating, Miss Marple said. If someone purchased cyanide-based silver dip recently, there will be a record. Slack was already moving toward the door. Hey, Doc, you'll come with me to Pratt's shop. Mr. Keene, I'll need you to open Sloane's premises for a thorough search. As the men departed, Miss Marple remained at the card table, studying the 2 rings, one tarnished, one bright, one innocent, one deadly. The murderer had been clever enough to use duplicate items. Understanding that the presence of a matching ring would deflect suspicion would suggest that nothing unusual had occurred. But they had not counted on Arthur Keen's professional eye noticing the difference in the ring's appearance, nor had they anticipated that Miss Marple would observe the frosted grain that no honest cleaning could produce. 2 rings, 1 box, and a space left empty where murder had been stored until the moment it was needed. The picture was becoming clearer, though still not complete. There were pieces yet to fit, questions yet to answer, but Miss Marple was patient. The truth, like a properly worked tapestry, would reveal itself, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 7. Alibi by Mummers and Matchbox. By early afternoon, Inspector Slack had returned to the parish hall with a ledger under his arm and a grim expression that suggested his investigations had borne fruit, though perhaps not the fruit he had hoped for. Miss Marple, who had remained at the hall reviewing her own observations, looked up from her knitting with polite inquiry. "Found something at Mr. Pratt's establishment?" she asked. Slack set the ledger on the table with more force than was strictly necessary. "Oh, I found something right enough. Question is, what to make of it?" He opened the ledger to a page marked with a slip of paper and turned it so Miss Marple could see. "The entry is dated 3 days prior to the Hallowe'en party," Miss Marple read aloud. "1 bottle Argentex silver dip, old formula. Professional use only. Purchased by—" She paused, her eyes moving to the signature column. "Mrs. M. Sloane." "Not just that," Slack said, his finger moving down the page. "Cotton buds and paraffin oil, same transaction. Pratt says he questioned the silver dip purchase. Told her it was dangerous stuff, cyanide-based. She claimed her husband needed it urgently for restoration work on some antique pieces. And Mr. Pratt accepted this explanation? He did. Says Mrs. Sloane had purchased supplies for the shop before, knew what she was about. He made her sign for it as required by law and thought no more of it. Miss Marple considered the implications. Cotton buds would be useful for applying solution to intricate metalwork, and paraffin oil. Pratt suggested it himself, actually, Slack said. Said if she was using the old silver dip, she ought to have paraffin on hand for protecting her skin. The stuff's corrosive. How very thoughtful of him, Miss Marple murmured. Though I wonder if Mrs. Sloane used the paraffin for quite the purpose Mr. Pratt imagined. Slack gave her a sharp look. Go on. Paraffin oil would serve admirably as a barrier between metal and heat. A thin coating on those tongs, for instance, would prevent them from becoming too hot to handle, while also leaving no obvious trace. So you're saying Mrs. Sloane prepared the tongs beforehand? I'm saying it's a possibility worth considering. She would have needed some way to handle them repeatedly throughout the evening without suffering burns that might raise questions. Slack made a note, then flipped to another section of his notebook. Right then. Let's establish the timeline for yesterday evening. Between 7:45 and 8:20, when the Snapdragon game began, where was everyone? He began ticking off names. Arthur Keene was with the Mummers, helping them with their props and costumes. He's got half a dozen youngsters who can vouch for that. Martine was at the tea urn, visible to virtually everyone in the hall. Miss Larrick was setting up the various games at different stations around the room. And Mrs. Sloane? Miss Marple inquired. According to multiple witnesses, she was arranging prizes and guarding her husband's curio stall. The stall was positioned near the storage area and the prize drawer, giving her access to both. Convenient. Very. As for Vivian Sloane himself, he was what you might call a social butterfly. Flitted from group to group, making jokes, flirting with the ladies, generally making his presence felt, establishing himself as very much alive and well, Miss Marple observed. No signs of illness or distress? None whatsoever. By all accounts, he was in high spirits, looking forward to the evening's entertainment. particularly the Snapdragon game. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. You mentioned Mr. Pratt admitted to lending the methylated spirits to Mrs. Sloane. When did this occur? Slack consulted his notes. Around 7:30. He arrived early to help with setup. Brought his jug of meths, thinking it might be useful for the storm lamps. Mrs. Sloane approached him specifically, said she wanted to make the Snapdragon flames more impressive. Asked if he could spare some spirits for that purpose. She approached him, rather than the other way round. That's what he claims. Said he didn't think twice about it at the time. Seemed like a reasonable request. Now, of course, he's sick with worry that he provided the means for murder. Poor man, Miss Marple said with genuine sympathy. Though I suspect the methylated spirits served a different purpose than he imagines. They were not the poison, merely the theatrical smokescreen. At that moment, Daphne Larrick appeared at the hall entrance, looking pale and anxious. She had been crying. That much was evident from her reddened eyes. Inspector Slack, you wanted to see me again? Yes, Miss Larrick, just a few more questions. Come in. Sit down. The young schoolmistress took a seat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Miss Marple observed her with compassion. The girl had been used, that much seemed clear, though whether she had been aware of her role remained to be determined. Miss Larrick, Slack began, I'd like you to think back to just before the Snapdragon game began. You were the one who drew the ring from the basin. Was there any particular reason you chose that moment, that location? Daphne's flush deepened. There was a note under my place card at the tea table earlier. I found it when I sat down. A note? Slack's attention sharpened. What did it say? Something about the ring choosing me, and that I should claim it if I could. It said there would be a forfeit, a kiss, and a secret. She fumbled in her handbag and produced a crumpled piece of paper. I kept it. I thought perhaps it was from Mr. Sloane. Slack took the note and examined it. This is typed. Yes, on a portable machine, I think. See how the letter R is slightly faint? That's a common fault with portable typewriters when the key needs adjusting. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. May I see it, Inspector? She studied the note carefully, noting the distinctive weak R that appeared in the words ring and forfeit. The typing was competent but not professional, and the paper was ordinary writing stock, the sort available at any stationer's. The vicarage has a portable typewriter, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Mrs. Clement uses it for parish correspondence. I've noticed that we appear on various notices posted in the church. Are you suggesting Mrs. Clement wrote this note? Slack asked skeptically. Not at all. But I am suggesting that someone borrowed the vicarage typewriter to create it. Mrs. Clement is very generous about lending her possessions for parish business. Daphne spoke up hesitantly. Mrs. Sloane did. Borrow the typewriter last week. I saw her returning it to the vicarage. She said she'd been typing labels for her husband's shop inventory. The pieces were fitting together now with inexorable logic. Mona Sloane purchasing the cyanide-based silver dip. Mona Sloane borrowing the typewriter. Mona Sloane requesting the methylated spirits and arranging the prizes. Mona Sloane with her steady hands and that telltale caustic mark under her fingernail. Miss Larrick, Miss Marple said gently. Did Mrs. Sloane ever suggest to you that you should be the one to retrieve the ring? The girl nodded miserably. She said it would please Mr. Sloane if I made the effort, that he'd find it charming. She was very kind about it, very encouraging. I thought she was being generous, accepting of the situation between her husband and myself. How very obliging of her, Slack said dryly. She steered you toward the ring. Made certain you would be the one to handle it and pass it to her husband. But I touched it too. Daphne protested. My lips touched it when I kissed it. Why didn't I die? Because you barely brushed it, Miss Marple explained. A fleeting contact with your lips, nothing more. But Mr. Sloane, playing to the crowd, pressed it firmly to his mouth, long enough for the poison crystals to dissolve, for the cyanide to enter his system. Daphne buried her face in her hands. I helped murder him. She used me as her instrument. You were deceived, Miss Marple said firmly. That is quite different from being complicit. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. I think it's time I had another conversation with Mrs. Mona Sloane. Chapter C. 8. Silver Dip and Shop Bill. The Search of Vivian. Sloane's curio shop took place that same afternoon, with Inspector Slack wielding a warrant and Arthur Keene providing reluctant assistance in identifying the various items and substances found on the premises. Miss Marple had not been invited to participate, but she learned the results soon enough. When Lady Bantry arrived at her cottage just before tea time, breathless with news, "They found it, Jane," Dolly announced, settling herself in the armchair by the fire. A bottle of that dreadful silver cleaning solution, half empty, hidden at the back of a cabinet behind some old picture frames. Indeed, Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. And were there any other significant discoveries? Arthur Keene identified it as the old cyanide formula, exactly the type that would leave those crystal deposits you mentioned. But here's the curious thing. Arthur swears Vivian never used such dangerous chemicals. Said the man was far too careless in his habits to be trusted with anything genuinely toxic. Miss Marple handed her friend a cup. Then how did the bottle come to be in his shop? That's what Slack is trying to determine. The bottle matches the one from Pratt's inventory, the very one Mona Sloane purchased 3 days ago. But whether she planted it there after the murder, or whether Vivian had it all along, no one can say for certain. What does Mrs. Sloane claim? She insists she bought it at her husband's request, delivered it to the shop, and thought nothing more about it. Says she assumed he was using it for restoration work, as she told Mr. Pratt. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And the rest of the shop? Was there anything else of interest? Dolly leaned forward conspiratorially. They found something in the till, actually a crumpled tissue with white residue on it. Arthur said it had that same sweet metallic smell as the silver dip, and there was a greasy smear on it as well, like the one you found on the tongs. How very careless, leaving such evidence about. Unless it was meant to be found, Dolly suggested. To implicate Vivian himself, perhaps. Make it appear he'd been handling the poison and accidentally contaminated his own ring. It was an interesting theory, Miss Marple reflected, though it seemed unnecessarily elaborate. More likely, the tissue represented a moment of genuine carelessness, a hurried cleanup that had been forgotten in the press of final preparations. Did Inspector Slack find any records pertaining to the business arrangements between Mr. and Mrs. Sloane? Miss Marple asked. Oh yes, a whole drawer full of legal documents. That's what took most of the time, actually. Arthur helped to sort through them, since he knew what to look for after that business with a bill of sale he'd refused to witness. And what did they discover? Dolly set down her teacup with a definitive clink. That Vivian Sloane was every bit the scoundrel Arthur suspected. The partnership agreement gave Mona equal shares in the business, but there were several unsigned documents that would have changed everything. A new bill of sale, transfer deeds, even a revised partnership agreement that reduced her to a salaried employee with no ownership stake whatsoever. Unsigned, you say? Completely unsigned. Arthur believes Vivian had been pressuring various local solicitors to witness them, but everyone who knew the situation had refused. He'd even approached a firm in London, but they required both parties to sign in their presence, and Mona had declined. Miss Marple considered this carefully. So Mrs. Sloane's financial position, if her husband had lived, would have been precarious, but not yet entirely lost. Exactly. She still had legal standing as a partner, but with Vivian alive and determined to push her out, It was only a matter of time before he found someone willing to help him circumvent the original agreement. Whereas with her husband dead, and no new documents executed, she inherits as his legal widow and business partner. The shop, the stock, everything. Arthur estimates it's worth several thousand, possibly more depending on the inventory. A substantial motive for murder, Miss Marple reflected. Not merely revenge for personal humiliation, but financial survival. Mona Sloan had been facing not just the loss of her marriage, but the loss of her livelihood, her investment, her future security. A desperate woman might well turn to desperate measures, yet something about the scenario troubled Miss Marple. In her experience, murders committed purely for financial gain tended to be more straightforward. Poison in the teacup, a staged accident, a violent confrontation. The Snapdragon murder had been theatrical, almost artistic in its conception. It spoke of someone who wished not merely to kill, but to make a statement, to turn the tables in the most public way possible. There's something else, Dolly continued, warming to her subject. They found correspondence between Vivian and Daphne Larrick. Love letters, Jane. Quite passionate ones, apparently, though Slack wouldn't let me see them. But the implication was clear enough. Vivian had been planning to divorce Mona and marry Miss Larrick once the business arrangements were settled. Poor Miss Larrick, Miss Marple murmured. To discover she'd been maneuvered into becoming an accessory to murder must be devastating. She's taken to her bed, I understand. Dr. Haydock has prescribed sedatives. The girl is thoroughly distraught. As Dolly chatted on about the various reactions in the village, Miss Marple's mind returned to that crumpled tissue in the shop till, a tissue with white residue and a greasy smear. It suggested hasty work, perhaps final preparations conducted in the shop before the items were transported to the parish hall. She thought of Mona Sloan's parcel from the post office, collected at 4:15. The timing would have allowed her to retrieve the poisoned ring, already prepared and crystallized, transport it to the hall, and make the substitution while supposedly arranging prizes and guarding her husband's stall. The paraffin oil would have been applied to the tongs, earlier, perhaps even the night before, time, enough for it to settle into an invisible coating that would serve its purpose without arousing suspicion. The cotton buds would have facilitated the precise application of silver dip to the ring's intricate scrollwork, ensuring the poison settled deep in the crevices, where it would not be immediately visible. Every element had been carefully considered, methodically prepared. This was not a crime of passion committed in hot blood, but a cold and calculated execution disguised as parlor entertainment. I must say, Dolly, remarked Miss Marple, if Mona Sloan did commit this murder, she's shown remarkable nerve. To stand there all evening handing out those tongs, managing the preparations, watching her husband flirt with that schoolmistress, all while knowing what was about to happen. It argues either complete innocence or absolutely chilling composure. Yes, Miss Marple agreed quietly. It does rather. She thought of Mona Sloan's face in the moment after Vivian had fallen, that brief, unguarded expression before the composed mask had settled back into place. Not shock, not grief, not even satisfaction, simply a kind of weary finality, as though a long and exhausting task had finally been completed. The question now was whether Inspector Slack had sufficient evidence to bring charges. A purchase of silver dip was not proof of murder. Access to the prize drawer was not proof of substitution. Even the typed note steering Daphne toward the ring could potentially be explained, away as innocent encouragement. What was needed was something conclusive. Something that would demonstrate beyond doubt that Mona Sloan had not merely the means and opportunity, but had actually committed the act itself. And Miss Marple suspected she knew exactly where to find that final piece of evidence. Chapter: Ecri the Fortune Apple Letter, the following. Morning brought clearer skies and a summons for Miss Marple to attend the parish hall once more. Inspector Slack had apparently decided that her observations, however informally acquired, might prove useful to his investigation. She arrived to find him in conference with Dr. Haydock and the Reverend Clement, while Griselda Clement hovered nearby with an expression of considerable distress. "Ah, Miss Marple," Slack greeted her. "Mrs. Clement has just brought something to my attention that may be significant. Perhaps you'd care to examine it." Griselda stepped forward, holding out a small folded paper. "I found it this morning when I was clearing away the place cards from the tea table. It had fallen between the table and the wall, quite hidden until I moved the furniture to sweep properly." Miss Marple took the paper carefully. It was similar to the note Daphne Lyric had received, typed on the same quality of stock. But this message was different. "Ring chooses you. Forfeit a kiss and a secret. Fortune favors the bold." Another note, Slack observed. "Seems our murderer was thorough in steering Miss Lyric toward that particular prize." "Where exactly did you find this, Mrs. Clement?" Miss Marple asked. It had slipped down behind Miss Lyric's chair. "I assume it fell from her place setting at some point during the evening. She mentioned finding a note under her place card, didn't she?" "She did indeed." Miss Marple held the paper up to the light from the window. "Typed on a portable machine with a weak letter R. The same machine that produced the first note, I should think." Griselda wrung her hands. "That's what troubles me, Miss Marple. You see, this looks as though it was typed on our vicarage typewriter. I recognize the fault in the R immediately. The key has needed adjustment for months, but we've been putting it off. And you mentioned that Mrs. Sloane borrowed your typewriter last week," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Yes, to type labels for the shop inventory. She returned it Tuesday evening very properly, with thanks. I thought nothing of it at the time." Griselda's voice dropped to a miserable whisper. "But now I wonder if she used it for more than labels." The Reverend Clement placed a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder. "My dear, you mustn't blame yourself. How could you possibly have known?" Miss Marple examined the note more closely, noting the precision of the typing, the evenness of the margins. This had been composed carefully, probably drafted in longhand first, and then typed out neatly. Not the hasty work of someone acting on impulse, but the deliberate preparation of someone following a well-laid plan. "May I see the first note again, Inspector?" "The one Miss Lyric received." Slack produced it from his case file, and Miss Marple laid the two papers side by side. The typing was identical, down, to the characteristic weak R and the slight unevenness in the letter E, which sat fractionally higher than its neighbors. "The same machine without question," she declared. And both notes served the same purpose, to ensure Miss Lyric would actively seek out the ring rather than merely hoping to find it by chance. "But why two notes?" Dr. Haydock asked. "Seems redundant." "Insurance, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested. "If one note was lost or missed, the other would still serve its purpose." Or possibly the murderer changed the wording and prepared a second version, then decided to use both for emphasis. Griselda spoke up hesitantly. "There's something else. When Mrs. Sloane returned the typewriter, I noticed it had been used rather extensively. The ribbon was noticeably more worn than when I lent it to her. At the time, I assumed she typed a great many labels. How many labels would one expect for a small curio shop?" Miss Marple wondered aloud. "Dozens, certainly." Arthur Keene's voice came from the doorway. He entered looking apologetic for the interruption, but probably not enough to wear down a ribbon significantly. Most dealers write their labels by hand. It's quicker and more personal. Typed labels are unusual in the antiques trade. Inspector Slack made a notation. So Mrs. Sloane may have typed considerably more than she claimed. Interesting. Miss Marple turned the notes over in her hands, studying them from every angle. Something about them nagged at her, some detail that didn't quite align with the overall picture. "Inspector," she said slowly, "when Miss Larrick received her note, she believed it might have come from Mr. Sloane himself. Is that correct?" "So she stated, thought it was a romantic gesture." "And yet Mr. Sloane, by all accounts, was not a man who typed his own correspondence. He had his wife manage the accounts and paperwork. Would he have had ready access to a typewriter?" Arthur Keene shook his head. "Not at the shop. All the typing was done by Mona. Vivian couldn't type to save his life. He'd joke about it sometimes, said he had no patience for machines." Then Miss Larrick's assumption that the note came from Mr. Sloane was based on wishful thinking rather than reasonable deduction, Miss Marple observed. Anyone with knowledge of the Sloanes' working arrangements would have known that a typed note was far more likely to have originated with Mrs. Sloane than with her husband. The implications of this settled over the group like a chill. Mona Sloane had not merely prepared the poison and arranged the staging. She had choreographed the entire evening, directing Daphne Larrick's actions as surely as if the girl had been an actress following a script. "Wicked," Griselda breathed, "to use that poor child so callously." "Practical," Miss Marple corrected gently. Mrs. Sloane needed someone to retrieve the ring and pass it to her husband. She could not do so herself without arousing immediate suspicion. Miss Larrick, young and infatuated, was the perfect instrument. Dr. Haydock had been examining his own hands during this discussion, and now he looked up with a troubled expression. "There's one more thing. I completed a preliminary examination of the body last night. The level of cyanide in Sloane's system was quite high, suggesting the poison was concentrated and readily absorbed." "From the crystals in the ring scroll work?" Slack asked. "Almost certainly. But here's what's interesting. The pattern of absorption suggests oral contact combined with moisture, saliva specifically. The act of kissing the ring dissolved the poison and introduced it directly into the mucous membranes, where it would be rapidly absorbed." Miss Marple concluded, "Far more effective than mere skin contact, which might have caused burns but not necessarily death." "Exactly. Our murderer understood human physiology well enough to know that a firm kiss, held for several seconds, would be fatal. A brief touch, such as Miss Larrick's, would not." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the cold calculation this represented. Mona Sloane had not simply poisoned a ring and hoped for the best. She had orchestrated every element to ensure the poison would be delivered in precisely the manner most likely to kill, while sparing the innocent intermediary who made the delivery possible. Miss Marple folded the notes carefully and returned them to Inspector Slack. "I believe you have your case, Inspector. The question now is whether Mrs. Sloane will confess, or whether you shall need to present all this evidence in court." Slack's jaw tightened. "Oh, she'll have a chance to explain herself. I'm bringing her in for formal questioning this afternoon. With what we found, I doubt even the cleverest solicitor could argue her innocence." But Miss Marple wondered. Mona Sloane had shown remarkable composure throughout this ordeal. Would she maintain that composure to the end? Or would the weight of evidence finally crack that cool facade? Only time, and one final confrontation, would tell. Chapter 10. Parish Hall, Ring, Flame, and the Woman Who Chose. The confrontation took place in the parish hall by a kind of unspoken agreement that the scene of the crime should also serve as the scene of its resolution. Evening had fallen again, and someone had lit the gas lamps, though mercifully no one had thought to resurrect the turnip lanterns. The snapdragon basin remained on the table, empty now and cleaned, a silent witness to what had transpired 3 nights before. Inspector Slack had assembled the principal parties. Mona Sloane, seated with rigid composure in a straight-backed chair. Arthur and Martine standing together near the wall. Daphne Lyric, pale and trembling, supported by Griselda Clement. Mr. Pratt, mopping his forehead despite the autumn chill. Dr. Haydock, the Reverend Clement, Lady Bantry, and Miss Marple herself, knitting quietly in her accustomed chair. Mrs. Sloane, Slack began without preamble, I'm going to lay out what we know, and you're going to have an opportunity to respond. After that, I'll be placing you under arrest for the murder of your husband, Vivian Sloane. Mona's face remained expressionless, but her hands, clasped in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 days before the Halloween party, Slack continued, you purchased a bottle of Argentex silver dip from Mr. Pratt's shop, old formula, cyanide-based. You also purchased cotton buds and paraffin oil. You claimed these were for your husband's restoration work. They were, Mona said quietly. Vivian requested them. Yet your husband, by Mr. Keene's testimony, never used dangerous chemicals. He was too careless in his habits. The bottle we found in his shop was half empty, Mrs. Sloane. What happened to the missing contents? Mona said nothing. Miss Marple spoke up gently. Perhaps I might explain, Inspector, how the method was accomplished. It may help Mrs. Sloane understand the completeness of the evidence against her. Slack nodded curtly. Go ahead, Miss Marple. Miss Marple set down her knitting and addressed the room at large, though her eyes rested most frequently on Mona Sloane. The murder weapon was not a ring, she began. It was a game, transformed into something deadly through careful preparation. Mrs. Sloane acquired 2 nearly identical silver rings, probably kept by her husband as duplicate stock. She treated one with cyanide silver dip, not rinsing it as one normally would, but allowing the poison to crystallize in the scrollwork. The other ring she left honestly tarnished. The poisoned ring, Miss Marple continued, was placed in the Snapdragon basin among the other prizes. To ensure the flames would burn brightly enough to mask the scent of bitter almonds, Mrs. Sloane requested methylated spirits from Mr. Pratt, which he added liberally to the brandy. This also created the violet-tinged scorch marks we observed on the tablecloth. Dr. Haydock nodded confirmation. The enhanced flames would have disguised the characteristic almond smell of cyanide. The tongs, Miss Marple went on, presented a problem. They would be handled repeatedly throughout the evening and would naturally become hot. But Mrs. Sloane could not afford to show discomfort or burns that might later raise questions, so she coated them thinly with paraffin oil, creating an insulating barrier that kept them cool to the touch. The greasy residue we found confirmed this. Arthur Keene made a sound of recognition. That's why her hands were so steady, why she showed no signs of burns. Precisely. But the most crucial element was ensuring the poisoned ring reached its intended victim in a manner that would prove fatal. Mrs. Sloane could not retrieve it herself without arousing suspicion. She needed an intermediary, someone innocent and unsuspecting. All eyes turned to Daphne Lyric, who had begun to weep silently. Using the vicarage typewriter, which she had borrowed on the pretext of typing shop labels, Mrs. Sloane created notes designed to steer Miss Lyric toward choosing the ring. The notes suggested romance and adventure, appealing to a young woman's sensibilities. Miss Lyric, believing the notes came from Mr. Sloane himself, followed their implicit directions. I was such a fool, Daphne whispered. You were deceived, Miss Marple corrected firmly. There is a difference. You touched the ring briefly with your lips, not long enough for the poison to dissolve significantly. But when you passed it to Mr. Sloane, he kissed it thoroughly, playing to the crowd. That sustained contact with moisture from his saliva dissolved the poison crystals and introduced cyanide directly into his system. Mona Sloane had remained motionless throughout this recitation, her face a mask. But now she stirred slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "You've constructed a very complete theory, Miss Marple, but theories are not proof." "No," Slack interjected harshly, "but we have proof aplenty. Your purchase of the poison, your borrowing of the typewriter, your access to the prize drawer and the basin, the parcel you collected from the post office on the afternoon of the party, timing, that allowed you to retrieve the prepared ring and make the substitution. And most damningly, the caustic mark under your fingernail, exactly the sort of whitening left by contact with cyanide solution." He pulled out the evidence bag containing the fatal ring. "This ring bears your husband's fingerprints, Mrs. Sloane, but also traces of paraffin oil and crystals that match the Argentex formula exactly. The tissue we found in your husband's till shows you prepared the ring there, probably on the afternoon of the party, using cotton buds to apply the solution carefully to the scroll work." For the first time, Mona Sloane's composure wavered. Her hands, clasped so tightly in her lap, began to tremble. "Why?" Daphne Larrick's voice broke through the tension. "Why did you use me? If you hated him so much, why not just poison him directly?" Mona looked at her, and for a moment something like pity crossed her face. "Because he always chose," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who would be chosen? Every decision in our marriage, in our business, in our lives together. He chose where we would live, what we would sell, how we would present ourselves to the world. And when he tired of me, he chose you." She turned to Miss Marple. "You're quite right about everything. I did prepare that ring. I did arrange the flames and the notes and the tongs. I orchestrated the entire evening because just this once I wanted to be the one who chose. I chose the method, the moment, the manner. I chose to make him kiss the very thing he valued most. His own performance, his own charm, his own certainty that he controlled every situation." "Mona," Arthur said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "he wasn't worth this." "He wasn't worth your life. Perhaps not," Mona agreed. "But my life was already gone, Mr. Keene. He'd taken it from me, piece by piece, year by year. The shop, the money, my dignity, my future. All that remained was the choosing of how it would—" And Inspector Slack stood and produced handcuffs from his pocket. "Mona Sloane, I'm arresting you for the murder of Vivian Sloane. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Mona rose with the same composed grace she had shown throughout. "I understand." "Inspector," as Slack led her toward the door, she paused beside Miss Marple's chair. "You saw it all, didn't you? From the very beginning." "I saw enough," Miss Marple replied gently. "The frosted grain in the silver, the two cool tongs, the careful choreography, but mostly Mrs. Sloane. I saw a woman who had been pushed beyond endurance." "Does that excuse what I did?" "No, my dear. It explains it, but it does not excuse it. Choosing a game is one thing. Making it a weapon is quite another." Mona nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right, though I confess I feel no remorse. Is that very wicked of me?" "It is very human," Miss Marple said. "But the law does not make allowances for human feeling, only for human action." After Mona had been led away, the group dispersed slowly, each person processing what they had witnessed. Lady Bantry came to collect Miss Marple, wrapping a shawl around her friend's shoulders. "Blue flames, and then that horrid quiet," Dolly murmured. Echoing her words from that first terrible evening, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose stiffly from her chair. "Yes, Dolly, festive flames burn clean, but they can still hide a very old bitterness." As they walked out into the November night, Miss Marple cast one final glance back at the empty parish hall, at the basin, that had held both entertainment and death, at the space where a woman's desperation had transformed a children's game into an instrument of murder, justice would be served as it always was. But Miss Marple could not help feeling a measure of sorrow for all involved. For Vivian Sloane, dead by his own cruelty. For Daphne Larrick, deceived and used. And most of all, for Mona Sloane, who had chosen murder when all other choices had been taken from her. The deadly Halloween game was over. The prizes had been claimed, the forfeits paid, and the final reckoning made. St. Mary Mead would remember this Halloween for many years to come, though not for the reasons the Reverend Clement had intended when he planned his innocent evening of parlor games and autumn festivities. Some games, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home through the darkness, should never be played at all.